wonder what happens when lawmakers decide prayer is more powerful than policy? Let's head to Tennessee. Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, where we deep dive into legislations and all things interesting, wild, and sometimes downright strange that happens in our politics. Today, we're talking about Tennessee's new approach to tackling social issues through a resolution for prayer and fasting. Yep, you heard that right. In July of 2024, Tennesseans were encouraged to turn to the divine intervention. And today, I have Stephen here to break it all down. Hi, Stephen.
Indeed. Hi.
So, quick question. How does this look in the UK? I know that in the US and, even the founding of the US was based off the separation of church and state from our UK counterparts. So I'm just interested to see what has changed with that for you all on that side of the pond, since the US came to be.
There's a really interesting sort of difference between the US and the UK. So two major differences, really. One is I would say that if you want to get elected in the US, you have to be religious. It'd be really interesting to look at how many legislators, across all the states actually claim to be atheists. I would think it would be a very, very small number, a vanishing small number. And not only do you have to be sort of fairly religious, you also have to be willing to talk about and express your religion. It's a big thing, isn't it? Political campaigns, political candidates on both sides, actually. I mean, Republicans more than Democrats, but even the Democrats themselves, they will always talk about their faith. Now, in Britain, it's different. We're a very secular state. Being an atheist is absolutely fine, not having any religion. Most people aren't very overt about their religious beliefs. And certainly in politics, it's considered to be quite poor form to talk about religion. And those politicians who do it will often suffer because of it politically.
Wow.
I mean, Tony Blair, our ex-prime minister, famously was quite religious, but he never mentioned it at all throughout the whole of his premiership. And then he actually converted to Catholicism towards the end of that. I went to see the Pope and things, but it was a really big deal.
Wow.
Because that's just not what our politicians do. So they tend not to talk about religion at all. But then the other big difference, of course, is that you have in America, you've got the separation of church and state written into the Constitution. Very, very important sort of principle. We have nothing like that in Britain, and in fact, our religion is sort of intricately entangled into our political system. So we have the House of Lords, which is our unelected house, and part of the people in the House of Lords who automatically sit there are Church of England bishops. So religious leaders are actually in one of our chambers making laws
Wow.
and sort of influencing laws and things. And so there's none of this idea that religion isn't allowed to be a part of sort of public life. So our schools, I mean, I think as we've spoken about before, we have a very strong tradition of religious schools that are state schools, state funded in exactly the same way, but they only allow pupils from a particular faith. And in fact, in all schools, right at the beginning of the day, there's an act of collective worship. And that, again, is actually written into the rules. All schools have to have this act of collective worship at the beginning. So it's a very odd situation where we're a much more secular state than the United States. And we don't talk about religion very much. And yet we have this sort of religious element within our politics.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the social governance of it seems to be impacting it, whereas in the US, the kind of general consensus here is that if you're not religious, you don't have good morals, and you need to have good morals to be a politician, so you need to be religious.
Exactly.
And where you are, it's like, I shouldn't be talking about my religion because that shouldn't have an impact on my work or honestly on the way that I'm doing my job.
Absolutely, and that's simply not true in the UK. No, well, it's not true anyway, actually. But no one really genuinely believes that. I mean, you just have to look around. There are plenty of secular states, and they're not overrun with lawlessness and immorality any more than
Everywhere
religious
else.
states. In fact,
Yeah.
I
The
mean, so
human
in Britain,
condition.
our yeah, exactly. It's human conditions. Now, whether you're religious or not has little impact, actually, I would say, on not whether you're a moral person or not. But yeah, so our previous prime minister, up until the general election, of course, was a Hindu. So we had our first Hindu prime minister. We've the mayor of London is a Muslim. And plenty of other sort of politicians and political leaders and so on come from other faiths. And so I think that may be part of why we don't do this, is that we are a very multi-faith, probably more so than the US. We're a multi-faith community and multicultural, and we sort of embrace that. And on all sides of the political divide, really, people sort of embrace that. I mean, recently, perhaps less so, in certainly on the right
Hmm.
of British politics, there's a more sort of unpleasant sort of anti-Muslim vibe going on. And of course, the Labour Party was sort of famously ran into trouble for a number of years over anti-Semitism, and they had to do a lot of work to try and remove that as well. So we're sort of very aware of these things that you need to respect everybody's religion. Of course, that is the absolute basis of the separation of church and state in
Hmm.
the US, isn't it? It's that it's not saying you shouldn't be religious or you should keep religion out of things necessarily. It's saying that all religions are equal, so you cannot choose a religion and say this is our religion. That we are a Christian country and not allowed to say that. It's a country where all religions are allowed to flourish, and for very good reasons. Obviously, the founding fathers looked around the world and
Hmm.
saw how sort of religious dogma was wrecking countries, particularly in Europe, and
Yeah.
sowing sort of discord and problems. And they said, we don't want any of that.
Right.
It's a very important principle should be protected.
It's interesting, you know, kind of turning to this legislation. Are we really looking at legislation that brings prayer and fasting into the political arena? It really does seem like we are living in a weird time where all of these things that we really held as deeply foundational beliefs to the United States are kind of
Mhm.
encroaching, and everyone's just like, you know, we need religion in our politics now more than ever.
So, I mean, obviously there are a lot of facts involved in this. So let's sort of get into it. So, Tennessee's legislature then officially designated July this year as the month of prayer and fasting, and it was through Joint Resolution 803. So it wasn't a sort of a generic "let's all come together and talk to whatever gods we believe in" type of thing. It was an explicit call for citizens to seek God's blessing and mercy for everything from violence to human trafficking. So the usual kind of stuff that we typically hope lawmakers would tackle with policies, really.
Hmm.
And worth noting that it was explicitly about Christianity. So there weren't
Hmm.
mention of any other deities or any other religions. It was purely driven through the sort of Christian orthodoxy within the state.
Instead of, say, funding a rehab program or passing laws to tackle corruption or violence, they just decided that, you know, prayer to a Christian God was the solution. Which, what's the thought process here?
So, Representative Monty Fritz, who sponsored the resolution, it was essentially saying in the resolution that they'd exhausted all other options. The financial and legislative incentives weren't working. They simply weren't able to come up with solutions for all the problems, which is quite a staggering thing for a legislator to sort of say, really,
That
because
is.
that's their job, right?
Right.
That's what they're elected to do. So they sort of figured, hey, let's sort of kick this one upstairs then, just like the founding fathers did, and say, let's see whether the Almighty has anything to say about fixing our problems.
Yeah, I guess it's a Hail Mary move, literally. Let's get into the meat of it. What about the constitutional issues here? I mean, the First Amendment seems pretty clear and the separation of church and state.
Absolutely, yes. So the First Amendment Establishment Clause definitely frowns upon the government endorsing any particular religion. I mean, it states Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and then of course it goes on to say, and you shouldn't set one religion above any other either. You know, it's very important to say that all religions should be respected,
Hmm.
but that it shouldn't be an establishment, and that's why it's known as the Establishment Clause. But this resolution certainly doesn't shy away from that. It actually quotes Bible verses and calls on God's intervention. And as you can imagine, this has a few people feeling a little bit uneasy, really. So the Freedom from Religion Foundation basically threw up their hands and said, "Wow, this is way too churchy for government business." And they even called for the governor to rescind the whole thing. And in their statement, they used the phrase, "Governor Lee, you are not elected pastor in chief." Ouch.
That is a burn. um, but you know, Tennessee is a pretty religious state, right? It's kind of an area here that we call the Bible Belt. And could this just be them reflecting their own demographics?
Oh yeah, for sure. So Tennessee is definitely on the high end when it comes to religious affiliation. There was some research done by the Pew Research Center, which found that about 81% of adults in Tennessee identify as Christian. So that's well above the national average, and obviously much higher than you would find elsewhere. And evangelical Protestant Protestants make up sort of over half of that. So yeah, in many ways, his resolution is just speaking to the crowd, and. And that's fair enough, isn't it? People are allowed to follow their religion, and obviously they elect politicians that reflect that as well. And so, on one argument, you can say, well, it's perfectly fair then for the sort of politicians to actually try and harness this, if you like, harness the faith of people to help make this state a better place. And you could say that's what they're doing, really. But let's not forget that the religious landscape, even in Tennessee, is shifting. So across the United States, religiosity generally is declining, and there are more people who don't particularly affiliate with religion, or particularly don't affiliate with organized religion. And so even in Tennessee, the percentage of these religiously unaffiliated folks has been steadily growing. So it's increased, according to the Pew Research, from 9% to 14% in just a few years. Wow. So this is a bit of an issue, I think, for this legislation. Not everyone in Tennessee is likely to respond to sort of state-sponsored Christian prayer.
It sounds like there's a fine line between representing the people and kind of imposing a particular belief system on them. 5% increases is a decent amount. And, with those 14% and growing numbers of people from non-Christian faiths, are they just kind of left out of this conversation? And is their prayer not worth it? Do they not want positive vibes sent to the legislator if they're not directed at God? Or
exactly. I mean, it's obviously one of the biggest criticisms of this particular resolution. They are alienating anyone who isn't a Christian. It's not. A lot of people would say that they're Christian. They might necessarily be like extremely devout or sort of going to church every week and really living the sort of the Christian life, as you say. And so, are you leaving these people out? Are they sort of being ignored, really? And it's also like saying, well, we've got these issues in our state. Well, these particular issues, but only a specific religious solution is welcome. Only a specific religious view on this can actually help solve these problems. And you've got all these folks from non-Christian faiths, and their voices aren't being heard in this call for prayer and fasting. And then, of course, people who think that government should be focused on, actually governing rather than actually calling for prayer.
Imagine that. This resolution clearly has supporters, has critics. And I kind of want to talk about the practicality for a minute. When we look at religion and we look at addressing problems like this, I feel like this is a way for the government to say, to what that man said, hey, we can't do anything else. We have to turn to divine intervention, and kind of wiping their hands of the issues and saying that, you need to pray hard enough for these solutions to come. And that can't fix Tennessee's major problems of addiction, violence, human trafficking, all these things that they're talking about.
But if you are a person of faith, then I would suggest that you might see prayer as a way of sort of seeking guidance and strength to tackle these tough issues. And the resolution supporters do argue that it's about more than just asking for divine intervention. It is about self-reflection, coming together as a community to find solutions. And that's a good thing. I mean, prayer in its essence is a form of meditation. It helps sort of focus the mind and clear your mind. And if you do it together in particular, it's a way of building community. And then once you get a community together, they can come up with powerful solutions to problems as well. But of course, the skeptics here are saying, well, look, prayer is nice, but what about real action? And that is true. It's great to ask for blessings, but when it comes to fixing problems like addiction or violence, you need actual policies as well. So you need the funding for the rehab centre. You need better mental health services, tougher gun laws. Of course, when it comes to gun laws, is one of the things where we often hear of thoughts and prayers, don't we? It doesn't seem to do much to stop that. So the actual legislators need to work as well as calling for prayer.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so much that only can be done from coming together, trying to build that community. And I think that is a really great point there of when we can come together as a community and see each other as people and see these problems as things that are impacting our day to day. I think that is a really wonderful sentiment and something that we definitely need in the US. I think that it's no secret here or in the UK or anywhere that, the nation is fracturing and we're not seeing each other as communities and kind of coming together to fix these problems. But, there's only so much that can be done before you have to, get on your feet and and do something. And the people responsible for this are our legislators that have been elected and given these positions.
It's true. I mean, it does depend on your perspective. And obviously, we have very different perspectives here than the Tennesseans who were sort of enacting and participating, obviously, in this month as well. And I'm sure that many of these Tennesseans were comforted and uplifted by the collective act of worship. And that's something, as we said, people coming together in common cause can be a very powerful force of good. But did it make a practical difference? Did they actually manage to come up with any new solutions? Well, probably not really. I mean, certainly for me, looking at this, I would have liked the resolution to have been more inclusive, to invite all faiths to participate. And I think that would have avoided, to a certain extent, that the sort of constitutional issues as well there, and set it much more clearly in context by talking about the actual policy as well. Saying, okay, we want you to pray and we want fasting and so on, but then we're also going to do all of these other things to help fix these problems.
Yeah. So good intentions, questionable constitutionality.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's one of those things that sounds very noble, but when you scratch the surface, it raises more questions than it answers, really. And at the end of the day, a month of prayer might help people feel better, but it's not going to fix Tennessee's deep-rooted problems on its own. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. You're going to need more than divine intervention.
That's it for today's episode of Beyond the Bill Number. Stephen, thanks for joining me.
Always a pleasure.
Don't forget to subscribe, and if there's any legislation that you're interested in us covering, comment below, and we'll catch you next time.